Hello everyone. Tonight, we will step quietly through the heavy wooden door of a medieval tavern, that peculiar place where the shadows cling to smoke-stained beams, and the faint, half-lit clatter of tankards raises questions before a single word is spoken. There's a faint, odd aroma in the air, something that dances between burnt wood, spilled ale, and an unplaceable tang of sweat mixed with herbs. Listen closely. Is that a distant laugh or a whispered secret? It's both, and it's waiting for you inside. If you think this will be a cozy, warm respite, a gentle escape from your day. I'm here to warn you, medieval taverns were anything but simple. They were chaotic social magnets, hubs of gossip, commerce, and sometimes chaos where you could find everything from a weary peasant to a swaggering knight nursing a questionable brew. So, stick with me all the way through, and by the end, you'll never look at a tavern sign the same way again. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. And, hey, why not tell me where you're tuning in from, and what time it is where you are? I love to know who's joining us for these little adventures. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let's get started tonight. The door creaks open, and you step into a room thick with smoke and warmth, though the fire pit struggles against the damp chill creeping through the stone walls. The space is crowded and noisy. Voices overlap, clinking mugs punctuate bursts of laughter, and the odd scraping of stools against the uneven floor adds to the dissonance. You take in the chaotic scene, wooden tables scarred by countless elbows, benches stuffed with bodies, pressed close for warmth, and the unmistakable sight of the barkeep perpetually wiping down a counter that never stays clean for long. Taverns weren't just places to drink. They were the social heartbeats of medieval towns and villages. They doubled as gathering spots where business was done, deals whispered, and news traded faster than the carrier pigeons could fly. Imagine it a marketplace of human stories where merchants haggle over prices and tales, and where travelers from distant lands bring strange accents and stranger tales. It's where the village's fabric was woven daily, often more tightly than the official town square meetings. Inside, you notice the mix of patrons. There's the mud-caked peasant sleeves rolled, and hands stained with the day's toil gulping hearty ale to wash down simple fare. Nearby, a merchant, adorned with a modest but clean cloak, calculates sums on a wooden tally. Even a knight in dented armor sits quietly careful not to disturb the raucous crowd but enjoying the brief escape from duty. This jumble of people so different in station yet so close in this dim room reminds you that taverns were one of the few places where social barriers blurred, if only slightly. You glance at your drink, a mug of ale, probably brewed earlier that day or the day before, thick with sediment and a bit sour by modern standards. Ale was the medieval drink of choice, cheaper and safer than water in many cases. Mead, a honeyed cousin, made occasional appearances, especially on festive days, while small beer with low alcohol content kept many hydrated. Interestingly, the brewing process meant these drinks often had some antiseptic qualities, which might explain why people sometimes preferred tavern ale to village wells. The food is humble, and filling thick stews bubbling with root vegetables and scraps of meat, crusty bread hardened by storage but still capable of soaking up broth and perhaps the occasional herring or cheese. If you're lucky, you might encounter something more unusual, roasted swan or a pie filled with eels, delicacies for the daring or the well-off. The aromas, earthy, smoky, and sometimes faintly sour, cling to the room like a stubborn fog. While the crowd fills their bellies and mugs, the entertainment takes center stage. Dice games litter tabletops, their throws met with cheers or groans. A minstrel plucks a lute in the corner, weaving melodies that both soothe and rile the crowd. Stories swirl like smoke tales of dragons, faraway battles, and local scandals, each told louder and more colorfully as the night stretches on. The tavern keeper is an unsung master of ceremonies, juggling customers' coins and occasionally breaking up disputes before they spill into chaos. Their knowledge of the regulars, their moods, and the ebb and flow of business is vital. One misstep, and a drunken brawl could ignite, or worse, the authorities might be summoned for breaking curfew laws. Yes, taverns operated under strict, often contested regulations, governing hours, drink limits, and behavior, reflecting the uneasy balance between control and revelry. Amid the raucous sounds, you might notice the subtle hiss of cats weaving between legs and barrels. These feline guests were essential for pest control, hunting down rats and mice attracted to spilled grain and crumbs. However, their presence was sometimes unsettling, especially for superstitious patrons who whispered about witches or bad luck associated with their shadowy prowling. Taverns doubled as news hubs, where stories traveled faster than horses, and rumors spun webs of truth and fiction alike. Here, the question of who was in the know mattered, and gossip could sway opinions or even local politics. Women's presence in taverns was a subject of debate. Some were employed as servers or entertainers, while others faced suspicion and social stigma, reflecting the complex and often contradictory attitudes towards gender roles. Of course, taverns weren't always safe havens. Pickpockets lurked and brawls occasionally erupted, fueled by strong drink and strong opinions. Yet, despite the occasional danger, the tavern was a place to belong to, laugh, to argue, and to dream. You might not find luxury or quiet here, but you would find life in all its raw and tangled glory. So, as the fire crackles and the night deepens, let yourself sink into this bustling scene, filled with smells, sounds, and faces that have shaped history in their own gritty way. Welcome to the Medieval Tavern, where every clink of a mug is a story waiting to be told. The Medieval Tavern was much more than a place to quench your thirst. It was the pulsing heart of the community, where stories and schemes took shape alongside mugs of ale. Unlike our modern bars, which often focus on drinking as the main event, taverns served as informal marketplaces, gossip hubs, and even rudimentary town halls all rolled into one chaotic package. Picture a time when official communication was slow letters rare and news largely oral. In such a world, the tavern was the fastest newswire. Traders arriving from distant cities brought news of shifting alliances, upcoming fairs, or even royal edicts whispered on the wind. The gossip exchanged between farmers and craftsmen could sway village politics or spark rumors that sent tongues wagging for weeks. It was a place where information was currency, sometimes even more valuable than gold. This multifunctional role made taverns indispensable, but it also placed them under the wary eyes of local authorities. Keeping control of what was said and who said it became a medieval dilemma. Laws regulating tavern hours, pricing, and conduct varied wildly from one region to another. Some towns were lenient, allowing taverns to be open late as long as noise was contained. Others enforced strict curfews, wary of the tavern's potential to foster unrest or insubordination. One of the most hotly debated ideas among scholars is the extent to which these regulations truly controlled tavern life. While some historians argue that strict curfews and fines kept behavior in check, others suggest that tavern culture thrived precisely because it was a space where social norms could be bent or broken. The reality likely lies somewhere in between. Taverns operated under watchful eyes, but the very nature of their role demanded a certain degree of freedom. This tension was mirrored in the clientele that filled the tavern benches. Unlike the rigidly stratified society outside, taverns offered a rare mingling of classes. You'd find peasants rubbing shoulders with merchants, traveling minstrels, performing for both the wealthy and the poor, and occasionally knights slipping in after a day on the road, armor still clinking. While social hierarchies remained the tavern's atmosphere, often softened those boundaries, alcohol had a way of equalizing conversations, at least temporarily. Still, it wasn't all camaraderie and song. Taverns were notoriously rowdy. Arguments flared over games of dice or card-like tiles, and tempers could flare as fast as the fires warming the stone hearth. The barkeeper's job extended beyond serving drinks. They were also peacemakers, occasionally refereeing fights or turning away the most unruly guests. Their reputations often balanced precariously between business savvy and the ability to handle drunken chaos without calling in the local militia. The food, while generally plain, was an essential part of the tavern experience. Thick stews made from whatever ingredients were available, root vegetables, salted meat. Sometimes offal were ladled into wooden bowls. The taste might not rival a modern restaurant, but it filled bellies and steadied nerves. Bread, often stale, was essential for soaking up the broth, and leftovers sometimes turned into pies or pastries. The smell of cooking mingled with the smoke ale and human sweat, creating a pungent but oddly comforting atmosphere. Entertainment, too, was a crucial draw. Minstrels and bards wandered from tavern to tavern, performing ballads that recounted heroic deeds, tragic romances, or humorous tales. Their music lifted spirits and kept the night alive. At times, patrons themselves would sing or recite poetry, encouraged by the buzz of ale and the communal warmth. Dice and board games were popular distractions, with stakes ranging from small bets to serious wagers that could cost a day's wages or more. A peculiar, lesser-known fact, tavern cats were unofficial members of the staff. These stealthy hunters prowled beneath tables and behind barrels, keeping the inevitable rat population in check. Their presence was both practical and superstitious. Some patrons welcomed the cats for their pest control, while others eyed them warily, associating felines with bad luck or witchcraft. This feline balance of fear and affection adds an odd charm to the tavern's ecosystem. Speaking of oddities, here's a surprising tidbit. While the phrase "good ale makes a good tale" is often cited, medieval scholars still debate whether the ale truly inspired better storytelling or simply lowered inhibitions, leading to louder and more exaggerated versions of the same old stories. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. Ale loosened tongues. But the desire to spin a good yarn was as much about community bonding as it was about intoxication. As the evening progresses, you might notice the growing darkness outside the flickering firelight, casting ever-shifting shadows on the wooden beams. The tavern's noise swells. Laughter grows louder. Arguments become more heated, and the stories grow taller. Patrons lean closer, sharing secrets and conspiracies that could change the fate of the village, or at least the next market day. In this environment, women's roles are particularly intriguing and debated. While some taverns employed women as servers or entertainers, others viewed their presence with suspicion, associating them with disorder or moral decline. There's evidence of women managing taverns themselves, navigating the tricky balance of respectability and business acumen. The tavern in this light becomes a stage where gender roles were negotiated as much as social ones. Whether it was a game of chance, a song, or a whispered rumor, every element of the tavern contributed to a complex social web. It was a place where daily life's struggles and joys played out in raw, unfiltered form. The tavern was more than stone and timber. It was a living, breathing hub of medieval society, its pulse echoing through every clink of a mug, every raised voice, and every shared smile. The patrons you encounter in a medieval tavern are an eclectic crowd united by the shared need for warmth drink and human company, but divided by status occupation, and even the stench of a hard day's work. It's a vivid cross-section of medieval society, thrown together beneath a low ceiling, blackened by smoke and framed by rough timber beams. On one side of the room you might find peasants, those who toil endlessly in the fields, still marked by dirt and sweat, their hands rough and nails cracked. Their faces are weather-beaten, and their voices carry the fatigue of manual labor. Yet their laughter is hearty and unfiltered. After a long day, the tavern's warmth offers a reprieve. It's a place to swap stories about the harvest, complain about taxes, or boast about the size of the day's catch. Nearby, merchants and craftsmen gather, clean by comparison, their clothing a bit finer and their manners more deliberate. They discuss goods prices and market rumors in a language seasoned by shrewdness and opportunity. The tavern here acts as a networking hub. Contracts may be struck over a tankard of ale, and partnerships formed before the evening's end. For some, the tavern is where fortunes are made or lost. Occasionally, a knight will appear, often a surprising sight for the regulars. Clad in armor or chainmail, dusty from travel or a recent skirmish, they carry an air of both authority and weariness. Knights might come seeking refuge, a hearty meal, or simply a break from the rigid hierarchy of court life. Their presence can shift the tavern's dynamic. Some patrons may eye them with respect or envy, others with suspicion, especially if the knight's temper flares after a few ales. The diversity of patrons raises questions about how social hierarchies played out within the tavern's crowded confines. Scholars debate whether taverns truly softened class divisions or merely created an illusion of equality while reinforcing existing power structures. Some argue that the shared space allowed for more fluid interactions, at least temporarily, while others point out that deep-seated social norms still influenced who sat where and who was served first. Moving through the room, you might notice the aroma of the drinks wafting through the air. Ale is king here, dark, cloudy, and potent. Unlike modern beer, it was brewed without hops, often resulting in a sweeter but less bitter taste. Mead, made from fermented honey, adds a golden sweetness and was reserved for special occasions. Another popular beverage was small beer, a low-alcohol ale often consumed by children and laborers alike, thought to be safer than water in unsanitary conditions. What you might find surprising is how much tavern patrons depended on these drinks, not just for pleasure but for health. Water sources were often contaminated, leading to frequent outbreaks of illness. The alcohol content, even if low, helped kill some bacteria, making ale a surprisingly safer choice. This practical aspect is often overlooked in romanticized visions of medieval drinking. Food in the tavern was straightforward and filling. Stews were the mainstay, slow-cooked in large pots with whatever was available. Root vegetables, salted meats, or occasionally fresh game. Bread, usually coarse and dense, was essential for soaking up broth or accompanying cheese and pickled vegetables. Some taverns offered pies filled with meat or fish, a convenient handheld meal. Exotic dishes were rare, but not unheard of. Spiced meats or imported wine could find their way onto the tables of wealthier patrons. One unusual fact you might not expect: the medieval palate was quite adventurous by today's standards. Ingredients like eel porridge mixed with herbs, or even roasted swan, were consumed by those who could afford them. While the typical tavern fare was humble, the culinary curiosity and availability could vary significantly between towns and regions. Entertainment was never far away. The air often carried the strains of a lute or harp, and minstrels told tales of heroic knights and far-off lands. Dice and board games littered tables with stakes, ranging from small coins to valuables worth a day's labor. Singing contests and storytelling were social glue, inviting participation across classes. Interestingly, these entertainments weren't just for amusement. They served educational and social functions, preserving oral histories and reinforcing cultural values. The tavern keeper played a vital role in this ecosystem. Not merely a bartender, they were diplomats, accountants, and sometimes referees. Their knowledge of regular patrons, local politics, and town gossip was unrivaled. They managed resources carefully. Overpouring ale could be costly. Underserving might lose business. Their success depended on balancing hospitality with prudence. The role of tavern cats is another quirky but essential detail. These furry guardians prowled between legs and barrels, hunting down vermin, drawn by spilled grain and food scraps. Cats weren't just practical, they carried a dual reputation. To some, they were protectors. To others, harbingers of misfortune, especially when linked with superstitions surrounding witches. Their presence added an unpredictable living element to the tavern's atmosphere. Noise was a constant companion. The mixture of voices, laughter, the scrape of wooden stools, and the occasional clang of a dropped mug created a lively but overwhelming cacophony. This sensory overload was part of the tavern's charm and challenge. Patrons often raised their voices to be heard, a practice that shaped social interactions and even architectural design to some degree. The sensory experience extended beyond sound. The sense of wood smoke, spilled ale, cooking stew sweat, and sometimes unwashed bodies intermingled to create a dense, unmistakable atmosphere. It was a smell that could unnerve the unaccustomed, but was comfortingly familiar to regulars, a reminder that here, among these smells, life unfolded in its most unvarnished form. These rich, overlapping sensory and social textures made the medieval tavern a unique place, sometimes rowdy, sometimes intimate, often unpredictable, but always alive. One of the most curious and essential features of medieval tavern life was the variety of drinks offered, many of which would surprise the modern palate and sometimes the stomach. Ale was the staple, but not just any ale. Brewed locally and often consumed fresh, it varied greatly in strength and flavor, ranging from light, small beer meant for daily drinking even by children, to darker, stronger brews reserved for the more daring. It's easy to picture ale as the medieval equivalent of beer today, but it was fundamentally different. Medieval ales lacked hops the bittering and preservative agent we're used to, meaning these brews were sweeter and less bitter, but more prone to spoilage. This freshness sometimes resulted in sourness, which people learned to accept as part of the experience, or a sign it was time to switch barrels. Mead, the honey-based drink, held a special place. Often considered more luxurious, mead was sometimes associated with feasting or special occasions. Its sweetness and aroma made it popular among nobles and traveling minstrels alike, though it was less common in everyday tavern fare due to the expense of honey. Wine also made appearances, especially in regions where vineyards flourished, such as parts of France and England. However, it was often the privilege of wealthier patrons, and not something a typical village tavern would stock in quantity. Instead, most tavern-goers stuck to ale, which was cheaper and more filling. Beyond the types of drinks, the containers themselves tell an interesting story. Mugs and tankards were usually made of wood or pottery, often rough and thick to withstand the lively atmosphere. Glassware was rare and expensive, reserved for the elite. The mugs would be stained with years of use, and their interiors sometimes harboring residues that might make the modern drinker wince. The quality and cleanliness of these vessels were matters of practical concern. Tavern keepers tried to maintain some level of hygiene, but the constant spillages and smoke made this difficult. Sometimes mugs would be rinsed in cold water or vinegar, but full sanitation as we know it today was a medieval fantasy. The experience of drinking itself was communal and boisterous. Ale was often consumed in large quantities, partly due to the lower alcohol content compared to modern beers, but also because it was cheaper than most foods. It lubricated social interactions, encouraged storytelling, and occasionally led to the infamous tavern brawls. One strange fact about medieval drinking habits is that they sometimes believed ale had medicinal properties. Some drank it to soothe stomach ailments or to stay warm during the cold months. This idea has roots in the fact that fermented beverages were often safer than contaminated water sources. It's also a reminder that medicine and superstition often danced hand in hand. Food in the tavern, while generally humble, was vital to balancing the effects of drink. The typical fare was simple thick stews brimming with root vegetables, like turnips, carrots, and onions, cooked slowly over the fire with scraps of salted or smoked meat. Bread was the ever-present companion, coarse and dense, perfect for soaking up broth or wiping a mug clean. In wealthier taverns, the menu might include pies filled with game birds, fish, or pork, reflecting regional tastes and availability. Roasted meats, especially pork or beef, were occasionally offered, though the expense often limited these to special occasions or noble visitors. An interesting culinary footnote is the frequent use of offal organ meats such as liver, heart, and kidneys, which were considered nutritious and economical. Modern palates might balk, but in medieval times nothing was wasted, and offal often made its way into pies, stews, or fried delicacies. Tavern cooking often relied on strong spices like pepper cinnamon, and cloves imported from distant lands, which were prized not only for flavor but also for their supposed health benefits. The medieval love for spiced dishes might seem excessive today, but it was a mark of sophistication and worldly taste. Entertainment was inseparable from tavern life. Dice games, board games, and card-like games offered distraction and the chance to win or lose hard-earned coins. Minstrels and bards roamed from tavern to tavern, singing ballads, telling tales of chivalry and romance, and sometimes spinning bawdy or humorous yarns that brought much-needed levity to the evening. Interestingly, tavern-goers themselves often became performers. Impromptu singing contests or storytelling circles were common, fueled by ale and the desire for community. This tradition helped preserve oral histories and local legends, passing them down through generations in lively, memorable fashion. The tavern keeper was more than just a pourer of drinks. They were social orchestrators, peacekeepers, and often confidants. Their skill in reading the room, managing conflicts, and keeping the establishment running smoothly was essential. A successful tavern keeper could build a loyal clientele, while a poor one might see the place spiral into disorder. Of course, tavern life wasn't without its darker side. Pickpockets and troublemakers lurked in corners, and drunken brawls were an occupational hazard. Yet even these dangers were woven into the fabric of the tavern, balancing the joy with the ever-present risk. So, as the fire flickers and the night wears on, the tavern continues its ancient dance where drink, food stories, and human folly blend into a timeless tableau. Taverns in medieval times were about more than just food and drink. They were vibrant centers of entertainment and socializing, where patrons sought both diversion and camaraderie. The atmosphere hummed with energy, fueled by a mix of music, games, storytelling, and the ever-present possibility of a sudden quarrel or burst of laughter. Games were a staple of tavern entertainment. Dice games, for instance, were wildly popular, offering the chance to test your luck or skill, and perhaps earn some extra coins or lose your shirt. The dice themselves were often crudely carved from bone or wood, and the rules varied from town to town with house variations ensuring no one game was ever quite the same. It's easy to imagine the excited shouts, the slamming of hands on rough wooden tables, and the occasional grumble of a lost bet filling the room. Board games and tile-based games, ancestors of modern chess and dominoes, also found a place in the tavern's hustle and bustle. These games encouraged strategic thinking and friendly rivalry, often acting as a quiet counterpoint to the louder celebrations. Occasionally, game playing could escalate into heated disputes which might only be resolved by the intervention of the tavern keeper or a well-timed song to diffuse the tension. Speaking of music, minstrels and bards were the stars of the evening, wandering from tavern to tavern with their lutes, harps, and voices. Their songs told tales of heroic deeds, tragic romances, and local legends, spinning the past and present together in a melody that captivated audiences. Sometimes these performers were professionals, other times talented amateurs, but all contributed to the unique ambiance that made taverns a cherished part of medieval life. The connection between music and storytelling in the tavern setting was more than just entertainment. It was a way to preserve culture and history. In an era before widespread literacy, these oral traditions kept important stories alive and connected communities. And, as you might expect, ale helped smooth the delivery, encouraging even the shyest patrons to join in with a song or a tale of their own. Social rituals also shaped the tavern experience. Toasting was a common practice, with glasses raised to honor friends, family, or local saints. These communal moments reinforced bonds and provided a rhythm to the evening's unfolding narrative. The phrase, "good health," or "to your honor," might be repeated often, accompanied by clinking mugs and shared smiles. One curious fact, the tavern sign itself was a medieval marketing marvel. Most patrons were illiterate, so colorful signs featuring animals, objects, or symbols became essential. A boar's head, a tankard, or a griffin painted boldly above the door helped people identify their favorite watering holes. This use of imagery wasn't just practical, it also offered tavern owners a chance to express creativity and draw in customers. The presence of traveling entertainers and merchants added another layer of richness to tavern life. Minstrels, jugglers, and storytellers brought new tales and music from far-flung places, enriching the local culture. Merchants, on the other hand, might use the tavern as a place to rest and conduct business, introducing exotic goods or news of distant markets. These interactions created a fascinating blend of the familiar and the foreign under one smoky roof. Taverns also served as informal courts of justice and arbitration. Disputes between locals might be aired and settled in the tavern with witnesses and character references made in front of a crowd. While this system was far from perfect, it added a communal dimension to conflict resolution and reflected the interwoven nature of social life. Another debated topic among scholars is the role of women in tavern life. Some accounts suggest women primarily worked as servers or entertainers, their presence accepted but limited. Others describe women as tavern owners or managers navigating the business with remarkable skill despite societal constraints. There were, however, concerns about women who frequented taverns as patrons. Some viewed this as scandalous, while others recognized the tavern as one of the few public spaces where women could socialize freely. The tavern's architecture contributed to its atmosphere and function. Early taverns were often timber-framed with thatched roofs, packed closely along busy streets. Inside, the rooms were low-ceilinged and smoky, with large hearths providing warmth and a central gathering point. Later, taverns in wealthier areas might feature stone walls, multiple floors, and private rooms for rent, blurring the line between tavern and inn. Hygiene in taverns was, unsurprisingly, a complicated affair. Myths about filth abound, but the truth is nuanced. While medieval cleanliness standards differed greatly from ours, tavern keepers often took steps to maintain some order. Regular sweeping, rinsing mugs, and airing rooms helped combat the worst odors and pests. The presence of cats, as mentioned before, was an effective and natural form of pest control. Noise smells and the dense crowd created a sensory overload that modern visitors might find overwhelming. Yet, for medieval patrons, this was part of the experience, a sign of life, warmth, and human connection. The smells of wood smoke, cooking food, spilled ale, and the unmistakable musk of so many bodies mingled into an atmosphere that was, if nothing else, unmistakably alive. The night would often end with rituals around closing time. Final orders called out mugs, drained, and farewells exchanged amid promises to return. Some taverns had strict closing hours, while others stayed open as long as the fire burned and coins flowed. As patrons stumbled into the dark streets, the tavern settled into silence, waiting to repeat its ancient story the next evening. In all its chaos and charm, the medieval tavern was a microcosm of its time, a place where history, myth, daily struggle, and joy mingled under one smoky roof. As the evening deepens, the role of the tavern keeper comes sharply into focus. Far from merely pouring ale and serving food, these individuals were the linchpins of tavern life, balancing the demands of commerce, social diplomacy, and occasionally outright conflict management. Their work was both exhausting and endlessly complex. Tavern keepers had to understand their clientele deeply. Knowing who was likely to cause trouble, who could be trusted to settle debts, and which patrons required a gentle hand or a firm word was essential. A savvy keeper could foster loyalty, ensuring regulars returned night after night, bringing friends and coin. On the other hand, poor judgment or indulgence could quickly turn a thriving establishment into a den of chaos, scaring away respectable customers. Their commercial acumen extended to managing stock-setting prices and negotiating with brewers and suppliers. Ale and food had to be procured reliably and affordably, while spoilage and waste had to be minimized. Given the perishability of many goods, particularly, ale inventory management was a constant challenge. Socially, tavern keepers often acted as informal arbitrators. Disputes that flared over games, insults, or drunken misunderstandings required swift resolution to prevent brawls or damage. Some keepers earned reputations for fairness, others for intimidating presence. The balance was delicate, too strict, and patrons might seek friendlier establishments, too lenient, and violence might become commonplace. Regulations and laws also complicated their duties. Taverns were subject to various local ordinances regarding opening hours prices and acceptable behavior. Enforcement varied widely, but keepers risked fines or closure if authorities found them in violation. This created a constant tension between maximizing business and adhering to rules a dance requiring both subtlety and occasional outright defiance. An intriguing aspect of tavern keeping was the occasional involvement of women. Widows or wives often took over management, particularly if their husbands died or were away. Running a tavern required resilience savvy and a keen understanding of human nature qualities many women demonstrated with remarkable success despite societal constraints. In addition to managing the crowd, and commerce keepers had to oversee the physical space. Maintaining cleanliness, such as it was repairing broken furniture and ensuring fire safety, were ongoing concerns. Open hearths, while vital for warmth and cooking, posed constant risks, especially in timber-built taverns packed with patrons. The tavern's very architecture influenced the keeper's role. Low ceilings trapped smoke, dim lighting required flickering candles or lanterns, and crowded rooms challenged visibility. The keeper had to keep a watchful eye not only on the cash box, but on brewing tensions or illicit activities happening beneath the surface. Behind the scenes, the keeper was often a repository of local knowledge and secrets. Confidences shared over a mug of ale might be passed along or kept safe, depending on alliances and interests. This role made tavern keepers integral to the social fabric, wielding subtle power in their communities. As night grew late, the keeper managed closing time rituals, announcing last orders, encouraging patrons to settle tabs, and sometimes urging the most reluctant to leave required diplomacy and authority. The final moments were crucial. A smooth closing could ensure a quick cleanup and a peaceful end to the evening. Interestingly, the tavern keeper's influence sometimes extended beyond their walls. In some towns, they acted as intermediaries between the community and local authorities, conveying concerns, complaints, or requests. This quasi-official role underscores how central taverns were to medieval social and political life. Despite the challenges, many tavern keepers found pride in their role. Their establishments were hubs of laughter song and shared humanity, a stage on which countless stories unfolded. They were, in many ways, the unseen heroes of medieval social life, maintaining order amidst disorder and welcoming all who crossed their thresholds. So, next time you imagine a medieval tavern, picture not just the raucous crowd or overflowing mugs, but the steady, watchful figure behind the counter, whose skill and grit held it all together. Medieval taverns were as much defined by their rules, or lack thereof, as by the patrons who filled them. Local regulations governing tavern operations were often the subject of heated debate, reflecting broader tensions in medieval society between authority and freedom. Across Europe, laws varied dramatically. Some towns imposed strict curfews, requiring taverns to close at sunset or shortly thereafter, aiming to curb drunkenness and disorder. Others set limits on the amount of alcohol served or banned certain games perceived as gambling. These measures were often motivated by concerns about public morality and safety, as well as the desire to maintain social order. Enforcement was inconsistent. In many places, tavern keepers wielded considerable influence and could negotiate favors or bribes to keep their doors open later or avoid fines. This informal system created a patchwork of practices, where a tavern's character might hinge more on the keeper's personality than on official law. The debates among scholars about these regulations center on their effectiveness and intent. Some argue that laws were primarily symbolic, reflecting elite anxiety over the unruly lower classes rather than genuinely controlling behavior. Others suggest that the existence of such laws indicates serious attempts to regulate drinking culture and prevent social unrest. One example comes from England, where the 14th century assize of ale set standards for ale quality and prices. This law aimed both to protect consumers from poor products and to prevent taverns from encouraging excessive drinking by keeping prices low. Its enforcement fluctuated over time, sometimes vigorously upheld, other times ignored. Taverns often operated in a gray zone, balancing economic survival with social expectations. In some cases, local officials relied on taverns to disseminate news or gather intelligence, creating a mutually beneficial but uneasy relationship. The tavern's reputation as a place of revelry and rebellion contrasted sharply with its function as a community hub. This tension is reflected in popular culture and historical accounts. Stories of tavern brawls and drunken excess abound. Yet so do tales of camaraderie, negotiation, and celebration. It's this complex interplay between order and chaos that gives medieval tavern life its rich texture. The debates extend to the role of tavern keepers in enforcing or subverting regulations. Some keepers embraced their role as moral guardians, refusing service to obvious troublemakers or cutting off drinkers before they became unruly. Others prioritized profits, serving freely and risking fines in hopes that business would outweigh penalties. This delicate balance could tip easily. A tavern known for violence or lawlessness risked closure, while overly strict establishments might lose clientele to more lenient competitors. Keepers had to read their communities carefully, adapting to shifting expectations and political climates. The tavern's social dynamics were also shaped by these regulations. Limits on alcohol consumption or game playing affected how patrons behaved and interacted. In places with strict curfews, evenings were often hurried affairs with patrons drinking faster and louder before closing time. Yet, despite attempts at control, taverns remained spaces of relative freedom. Within their smoky walls, the rigid hierarchies of medieval society softened, allowing for moments of connection across class and status. This freedom sometimes alarmed authorities, but was essential to the tavern's enduring appeal. The debates over tavern regulations mirror larger questions about medieval governance, social control, and community life. Taverns stand as microcosms of these struggles, places where law, custom, and human nature collided. In the end, whether through formal rules or informal understanding, tavern life was shaped by the push and pull between order and disorder. This tension created a lively, sometimes volatile environment that was as much a part of medieval life as plowing fields or attending church. So, when you picture a medieval tavern, remember it was not just a den of drinkers, but a contested space reflecting the complex dance of power, community, and human desire. The sensory experience of a medieval tavern was overwhelming, in the best and worst ways, a symphony of sounds, smells, and sights that could delight or assault the unaccustomed visitor. Imagine stepping into a room where every sense is engaged, often to the point of exhaustion. Yet that very intensity created the tavern's unique character. Sound was the first and most immediate assault. The room buzzed with overlapping conversations, laughter, and occasional arguments, all competing against the background clatter of mugs and tankards clinking on rough wooden tables. Chairs scraped as patrons shifted position or rose suddenly, while the occasional bark or shout punctuated the din. The crackling fire and the creak of timber beams added their own layers to the acoustic tapestry. Yet this cacophony was not random noise. It was the soundtrack of communal life. Patrons raised their voices not just from drunkenness, but to be heard over the crowd. This constant hum of chatter formed a social fabric binding people together in the moment. Smell was another dominant presence. The mixture of wood smoke from the hearth, the tang of spilled ale fermenting on the floor, cooking stew simmering over open flames, and the unmistakable musk of human bodies created an aroma both rich and pungent. For those used to it, this scent was a comforting sign of warmth and fellowship. For newcomers, it might have been overwhelming or even repellent. The smoky air, heavy with particulate matter, dimmed the light and clung to clothes and hair. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the low ceilings and rough walls, enhancing the sense of mystery and intimacy despite the crowd. The touch of the tavern was no less vivid. Rough wooden benches pressed against skin, sometimes sticky with spilled drinks or sweat. The warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the damp chill creeping through stone walls. Hands grasped mugs. Elbows jostled neighbors, and the occasional playful shove was part of the evening's social dance. Taste was central, of course. Ale, sometimes sour or bitter, warmed the throat and loosened tongues. Stews offered hearty, sometimes smoky flavors, tempered by the occasional pungency of strong herbs or spices. Bread, dense and chewy, provided a solid base for these tastes. Sight was limited, but evocative. Flickering candlelight revealed faces both familiar and strange eyes, glinting with humor fatigue or mischief. The smoky haze softened edges, turning the room into a tableau that seemed both timeless and transient. One strange sensory fact tavern air was often thick enough to affect breathing, particularly for those with respiratory issues. Yet patrons adapted learning to inhale the smoky miasma as part of the experience. This resilience speaks to the human capacity to find comfort in the midst of discomfort. The sensory overload created a paradoxical effect. While some might imagine the tavern as unpleasant, it was precisely this intensity that drew people in. The noise and smells were signs of life connection and shared humanity. They marked the tavern as a space apart from the cold isolation of home, or the rigid formality of church or court. Moreover, the sensory environment influenced social behavior. The loudness fostered a sense of equality. Everyone had to raise their voice to be heard, blurring hierarchies. The dim light encouraged intimacy, making secrets easier to share and laughter more genuine. The smells, while potent, served as a kind of olfactory signature for the tavern, linking patrons to the place and each other. Familiar aromas could evoke memories of past gatherings, or signal the approach of favorite foods or drinks. This sensory richness was not just background, it shaped how people experienced and remembered tavern life. The sounds, smells, and tactile sensations became intertwined with stories and emotions, making the tavern a repository of communal memory. Despite the challenges, medieval taverns thrived on this complex sensory mix. Patrons returned night after night, drawn by the promise of warmth, companionship, and the chance to be part of something larger than themselves. So, as you imagine yourself in this smoky, noisy room, take a deep breath if you dare, and let the sights, sounds, and smells wash over you. It's not just a tavern you are entering. It's a world alive with history, humanity, and the chaotic beauty of everyday life. Tavern cats may not be the first thing that comes to mind when picturing medieval nightlife. Yet these stealthy felines played an oddly important role in the ecosystem of the tavern. Their presence was both practical and at times a source of superstition, adding a curious flavor to the already rich tapestry of tavern life. Rats and mice were a persistent problem. Spilled grain food scraps and damp conditions created a perfect breeding ground for vermin. Left unchecked, these pests could spread disease and spoil valuable supplies. Cats, agile hunters that they are, became the tavern's natural pest control service. Their quiet prowling under tables and between barrels helped keep rodent populations in check, protecting both patrons and property. Yet the relationship between tavern-goers and cats was not without tension. In an age when superstition and fear of witchcraft were widespread, black cats in particular were viewed with suspicion. Some believed these animals to be familiars, supernatural companions of witches or omens of bad luck. Their presence could unsettle more superstitious patrons, especially when tavern ale had already loosened tongues and tempers. Despite this, tavern cats were generally tolerated and even welcomed. They became part of the tavern's informal staff expected to earn their keep by hunting. Some tavern keepers took pride in their cats, seeing them as both companions and protectors. Occasionally, patrons would offer scraps or small tokens to curry favor with these furry guardians. The cats themselves added a living dynamic to the tavern's atmosphere. Their graceful movements contrasted with the human chaos, their sudden appearances or disappearances often met with amusement or irritation. Stories and legends about tavern cats sometimes circulated, adding to the tavern's mystique. This blend of practicality and superstition surrounding tavern cats is a reminder of how medieval people navigated a world where the natural and supernatural often overlapped. Cats were both animals and symbols, straddling the line between the everyday and the uncanny. Interestingly, cats' importance in pest control had a direct impact on the economic life of taverns. By protecting stored grain and foodstuffs, they helped maintain the viability of the establishment. Without cats, tavern keepers might have faced higher costs and losses which could threaten their livelihood. The presence of cats also contributed to the sensory environment of the tavern. The faint sound of paws padding on wooden floors, the occasional yowl or hiss, and the soft fur brushing against legs all added layers to the sensory tapestry. For many patrons, the cats were familiar if unpredictable companions during long evenings. From a social perspective, tavern cats sometimes became mascots or symbols of particular establishments, fostering a sense of identity and community. Stories about a clever or brave cat could be told and retold, joining the oral traditions passed down among patrons. In a broader sense, the role of tavern cats exemplifies the complex interactions between humans and animals in medieval life. Animals were not simply pets or beasts of burden, but active participants in social and economic systems often embedded in cultural beliefs and practices. So the next time you imagine a medieval tavern scene, picture not only the clinking mugs and raucous laughter, but the sleek shadow slipping silently beneath the tables, a cat hunting, watching, and quietly shaping the life of the tavern. Taverns served as the medieval world's original social network centers, where news, gossip, and rumors spread faster than any royal decree or messenger could travel. Within their smoky walls, information flowed freely, transforming each tavern into a dynamic hub of communication that influenced local communities and beyond. Before the age of newspapers, radio, or instant messaging, oral transmission was king. Travelers brought tidbits from distant towns, merchants shared market reports, and locales exchanged the latest village happenings. In the tavern, these stories mingled, sometimes blending fact and fiction into lively tales that kept listeners on the edge of their seats. The tavern's role as a rumor mill was double-edged. On one hand, it fostered a sense of community, keeping people connected through shared knowledge and experiences. On the other, it could be a source of misinformation, exaggeration, or even malice. False rumors might damage reputations or spark conflicts, while true news could inspire hope or fear. Interestingly, historians debate the accuracy and impact of tavern gossip. Some argue it was mostly harmless social chatter, a natural part of human interaction. Others suggest it played a significant role in shaping public opinion, influencing everything from local elections to resistance against unjust rulers. News in taverns was not limited to politics or economics. Tales of witch trials, military victories, or defeats, natural disasters, and royal scandals captivated listeners, often becoming the subject of spirited debate. The tavern's oral tradition allowed these stories to evolve, adapting to audience tastes and local contexts. The importance of tavern communication extended beyond the village or town. Merchants and travelers often acted as informal correspondents, carrying news along trade routes and between settlements. In this way, taverns formed a loosely connected network, knitting together disparate parts of medieval society. The social dynamics of news sharing were complex. Gossip could empower some while marginalizing others. Those who controlled information, like tavern keepers or influential patrons, held subtle sway over conversations and opinions. This power dynamic added another layer to the tavern's role as a social institution. Women's participation in this information flow is a fascinating topic. While often excluded from formal political power, women in taverns, whether as servers, entertainers, or patrons, contributed significantly to the spread and shaping of news and gossip. Their voices, though sometimes marginalized, were integral to the fabric of community knowledge. Taverns also served as places where public notices might be read aloud, including proclamations from authorities or announcements of market days and fairs. This official use coexisted with the more informal and often unruly exchange of stories and rumors. One strange but true fact: some taverns became infamous for their role in political intrigue or sedition, where dissenting opinions were voiced and plots discussed in hushed tones. Authorities sometimes monitored these establishments, wary of the power of the spoken word to mobilize or destabilize communities. Despite the risks, taverns remained vital spaces for social interaction and information exchange. They were places where news was not only consumed, but created, shaped by the storyteller's listeners and the ale-fueled imagination of the crowd. So, when you think of a medieval tavern, envision a buzzing hive of voices sharing the day's triumphs and tragedies, weaving a collective narrative that both reflected and shaped the world outside. The presence of women in medieval taverns is a topic layered with complexity, ambiguity, and debate. Their roles and reputations in these smoky, bustling spaces varied widely depending on time, place, and social context, ranging from vital contributors to scandalous troublemakers in the eyes of contemporaries. Women were often employed as tavern servants, carrying mugs of ale and plates of stew through crowded rooms. This was hard, exhausting work requiring speed, balance, and a tolerance for the tavern's chaotic environment. They were the lifeblood of service, ensuring patrons were fed and watered. Some women also sang or danced, providing entertainment to keep spirits high and wallets open. On the flip side, taverns were frequently associated with moral dangers, especially concerning women. Prostitutes were known to frequent taverns, sometimes operating openly or under the radar, which contributed to negative stereotypes. These associations led to official regulations aiming to control or exclude women from certain tavern roles or spaces. Local authorities and church leaders often condemned tavern life for encouraging licentious behavior. Yet, historical records reveal that some women rose to positions of authority within tavern culture, owning or managing establishments, especially widows who inherited businesses. Running a tavern demanded shrewd business sense, social skill, and resilience qualities. Many women demonstrated with surprising success despite restrictive gender norms. The debate among historians centers on the degree to which women could participate as patrons, rather than just employees or proprietors. Some evidence suggests women gathered socially in taverns, while other accounts emphasize their exclusion or marginalization. The truth likely varied widely, influenced by local customs and economic necessity. Women's presence in taverns also reflects broader tensions in medieval society regarding gender roles and public space. Taverns were among the few places where women could interact more freely outside the home, though often under scrutiny. This made them both sites of social opportunity and conflict. Interestingly, women's involvement extended beyond the tavern's immediate walls. They were often key transmitters of news and gossip, influencing the social fabric through networks that connected taverns' homes and markets. Their voices, though sometimes silenced or sidelined in official records, resonated through oral tradition. The moral anxieties about women in taverns intersected with concerns about alcohol consumption and public order. Women drinking or socializing publicly challenged expectations of female decorum, stirring fears of social decay. These concerns fueled laws restricting women's roles in taverns, though enforcement was uneven. Some tavern keepers leveraged the presence of women, servers, entertainers, or proprietors to attract a broader clientele. Women's participation could lend a semblance of respectability, or soften the rougher edges of tavern life, making establishments more appealing to families or wealthier patrons. Culturally, women's roles in taverns are reflected in literature, art, and folklore, often ambivalent or contradictory. Tales of tavern maidens range from virtuous and clever to cunning, and morally suspect, mirroring societal attitudes toward female independence and sexuality. In some, the place of women in medieval taverns is not a single story, but a mosaic of experiences. It reveals the complexities of medieval social life, where gender, class, and morality intertwined in intricate ways. So, as you imagine a medieval tavern's smoky glow, remember the women whose footsteps and voices threaded through its life, sometimes celebrated, sometimes condemned, but always essential to the story. Taverns, with their lively crowds and flowing ale, were also magnets for crime and disorder. Pickpockets, swindlers, and brawlers found fertile ground in the crowded, chaotic environment, making the tavern both a place of pleasure and potential peril. Pickpockets thrived amid the close quarters and distracted patrons. The constant movement, the clatter of mugs, and the loud conversations created perfect cover for nimble fingers. Travelers unfamiliar with the local regulars were particularly vulnerable. Losing a coin purse or small valuables could ruin a journey, making caution essential. Some taverns developed reputations for being particularly risky. Stories of stolen wallets or rigged dice games spread quickly, warning newcomers to stay alert or avoid certain establishments altogether. However, these reputations were double-edged. They could also attract a more adventurous or unscrupulous clientele, further fueling lawlessness. Brawls were another frequent hazard. heated debates over politics, religion, or personal insults often escalated quickly, especially after several rounds of ale. Fists flew, chairs were upended, and the tavern keeper might have to step in to restore order. These fights were sometimes brutal, but often part of the rough camaraderie that defined tavern life. The role of the tavern keeper in managing these outbreaks was critical. Some relied on intimidation or brute strength to keep the peace. Others employed more diplomatic means, separating combatants or calling in local constables when necessary. Successful keepers balanced firmness with tolerance, allowing patrons to vent frustrations without descending into chaos. Local authorities were concerned about tavern violence, sometimes instituting patrols or regulations aimed at reducing incidents. However, enforcement was inconsistent, and the tavern's role as a social safety valve allowing people to blow off steam was recognized, if grudgingly. The architecture and layout of taverns could influence the likelihood of trouble. Crowded rooms, low lighting, and tight spaces made it easier for fights to erupt and harder to control them. Some taverns incorporated separate rooms or partitions to isolate noisy groups or provide quiet spaces for negotiation. Interestingly, some patrons came specifically seeking the rougher side of tavern life. Fighters, mercenaries, or those seeking employment in dubious trades might use taverns as meeting places. This added another layer to the complex social web within the tavern, blending legitimate business with underworld dealings. Despite these risks, taverns remained popular gathering places. The promise of warmth, drink, and companionship often outweighed concerns about safety. The unpredictability of tavern life was part of its allure, a dance between pleasure and danger. This balance between revelry and risk shaped the character of the medieval tavern. It was a place where joy and violence could exist side by side, reflecting the complexities of human nature and social life. So, next time you picture a medieval tavern, imagine not only the laughter and music, but also the shadowy corners where disputes might ignite, reminding us that every story has its darker side. Taverns and inns often get lumped together, but medieval travelers would have known the difference well. Each offered distinct experiences and services tailored to different needs and social expectations. Taverns primarily focused on drink, food, and socializing. They were often lively, crowded spaces where locals gathered to unwind after work or share news. Sleeping accommodations were usually not part of the package, although some taverns did provide basic rooms or shared sleeping quarters for travelers. The emphasis was on community and conviviality rather than comfort. Inns, on the other hand, were more formal establishments catering to travelers needing a place to rest overnight. Inns offered private or semi-private rooms, stabling for horses, and more substantial meals. They were often situated along major roads or near market towns, strategically placed to serve merchants, pilgrims, and nobles on the move. The quality of inns varied widely. Wealthier inns might feature comfortable beds, fireplaces, and separate dining rooms, while more modest ones offered little more than a straw mattress and a cold room. Pricing reflected these differences, and inns often required reservations or recommendations. Tavern sleeping arrangements, when available, were typically communal. Shared rooms with multiple beds or even mattresses laid out in a common space were common. Privacy was minimal, and conditions could be cramped and noisy. Travelers had to be prepared for interruptions and the general chaos of a bustling social environment. An interesting fact is that some inns and taverns blurred the lines, combining features to attract a broader clientele. In smaller towns, a single establishment might serve as both tavern and inn, adapting services to customer demand. The distinction between taverns and inns also had social implications. Inns were associated with travel and commerce often frequented by outsiders and wealthier patrons. Taverns were more closely linked to the local community, serving as daily gathering spots for residents. Regulations sometimes distinguished between these establishments with different licensing and taxation rules. Inns, because of their role in lodging, were often subject to stricter oversight and higher taxes. The architectural design of inns reflected their dual function. They typically featured courtyards for horses' separate sleeping quarters and larger kitchens. Taverns were generally simpler, with open halls, long tables, and a central hearth. This difference affected the atmosphere as well. Inns offered a degree of quiet and privacy valued by travelers, while taverns were centers of noise socializing and sometimes disorder. Choosing between the two depended on one's needs and social status. Travelers navigating medieval roads relied heavily on inns for safety and rest, particularly on long journeys. However, they might stop at a tavern along the way for a meal or drink, especially if lodging was not required. The social dynamic within inns could be more formal, with expectations of decorum influenced by the presence of wealthier guests or officials. Taverns, by contrast, were more egalitarian in atmosphere, encouraging open and often rowdy interaction. In literature and historical accounts, inns often appear as settings for significant meetings, secret plots, or chance encounters. Taverns, meanwhile, are portrayed as hubs of gossip, merriment, and the rougher edges of society. Ultimately, the choice between tavern and inn was a choice between two worlds, one vibrant and communal, the other quieter and more private. Both played essential roles in medieval life, catering to different facets of travel and social interaction. So, as you picture a medieval knight's journey, imagine the traveler weighing their options: loud tavern warmth, or the quiet refuge of an inn, and the stories that unfolded in each. One of the most charming and contested sayings associated with medieval taverns is that good ale makes a good tale. This phrase captures a widely held belief that alcohol, particularly ale, was a catalyst for storytelling, laughter, and social bonding. But, like many popular notions, its truth is more nuanced and debated among scholars. Ale was indeed central to the tavern experience. Its mild, intoxicating effects loosened tongues, lowered inhibitions, and encouraged people to share stories they might otherwise keep to themselves. In the warmth of the tavern, patrons felt freer to express humor, emotion, and creativity, turning everyday events into grand adventures or humorous anecdotes. Yet, scholars debate whether ale truly enhanced the quality of storytelling or merely amplified the volume and enthusiasm with which tales were told. Some argue that alcohol didn't improve narrative skill, but rather encouraged exaggeration and repetition, creating a lively, if sometimes less coherent, oral tradition. This debate reflects broader questions about the social function of storytelling. Stories in taverns were not just entertainment, they reinforced communal bonds, transmitted cultural values, and provided a safe space for discussing taboo topics. Ale's role was as a social lubricant, enabling these interactions rather than dictating their content or quality. The phrase also hints at the communal nature of tavern life. Stories were shared, built upon, and embellished collectively, with listeners contributing reactions, questions, and their own versions. The result was a dynamic, evolving narrative shaped by the group's energy and the evening's mood. Another factor is the ritualistic aspect of drinking. Toasts and shared cups created moments of connection and heightened attention, setting the stage for storytelling. The sensory pleasures of ale, its taste, warmth, and the act of raising a mug added layers to the social experience. Interestingly, the idea that alcohol-inspired creativity is not unique to the medieval period. Across cultures and eras, drink has been linked to artistic expression for better or worse. The medieval tavern was one of many contexts where this relationship played out in vivid social ways. This phrase also underscores the importance of taverns as spaces of informal education and cultural transmission. Stories told and retold within these walls preserved history, reinforced identity, and sometimes challenged authority. Of course, not all stories told in taverns were wholesome or true. Some were tall tales, others scandalous gossip, and a few dangerously subversive. The ale-fueled atmosphere could encourage both wisdom and folly, insight and misinformation. Yet, it is precisely this mixture that gave medieval taverns their unique character places where human imagination met social reality in a bubbling brew of laughter, debate, and storytelling. So, while good ale makes a good tale might not be an absolute truth, it captures the spirit of medieval tavern life, where drink, story, and community blended to create moments that resonated long after the last mug was emptied. Tavern signs and symbols were the medieval world's original advertising. Vibrant, imaginative, and essential tools for attracting patrons in an age when literacy was scarce. These signs did more than mark a building. They told stories, signaled quality, and created identities that lingered in the minds of locals and travelers alike. Since many people couldn't read, pictorial signs became a universal language. A boar's head, a lion rampant, a tankard overflowing with ale, or a red lion rampant might adorn the front of a tavern, instantly conveying something about its character or reputation. These images were painted boldly and often hung on wrought iron brackets swaying in the wind to catch the eye of passers-by. The choice of symbol was rarely random. Some signs referenced local legends or heraldry, tapping into regional pride and identity. Others suggested hospitality strength or joviality qualities patrons might seek in their drinking establishments. The symbols also helped distinguish one tavern from another, especially in crowded market towns. Sign painters were skilled artisans who had to create clear, memorable images on weather-worn wood or metal. The signs were often brightly colored, employing reds, blues, and golds that could be seen from a distance. This artistry added to the tavern's allure and was an early form of branding. Interestingly, tavern signs sometimes changed over time to reflect shifts in ownership, local events, or changing fashions. A sign might be repainted or replaced to attract a new clientele, or distance the establishment from past troubles. The tradition of using animal imagery was particularly strong. Animals like bears, wolves, dragons, and griffins appeared frequently, evoking strength, wildness, or mythical protection. Human figures, saints, kings, or jesters, also featured prominently, linking taverns to larger cultural narratives. Some tavern signs became so well known that they appeared in literature and folklore, serving as meeting points for secret plots or memorable gatherings. These signs were landmarks in both the physical and social landscape. The use of symbols extended beyond the tavern door. Inside, signs and motifs decorated walls, tankards, and even staff clothing, reinforcing identity and creating a sense of belonging among patrons. One strange fact, in some cases tavern signs were believed to have magical or protective properties, warding off evil spirits or bringing good fortune. Whether or not patrons believed this, the signs certainly contributed to the tavern's atmosphere of mystery and tradition. These signs also played a practical role during times of conflict or plague, helping authorities track taverns or issue notices. A tavern's sign might appear on official lists linking the establishment to broader civic life. The legacy of medieval tavern signs persists today, inspiring pub names and logos around the world. Their combination of artistry, symbolism, and social function speaks to the enduring power of visual storytelling. So, picture the bustling medieval street, the sun glinting off painted wood, and the colorful signs beckoning all manner of patrons inside a vivid welcome to the world of the tavern. Traveling minstrels and merchants were vital to the vibrant life of medieval taverns, bringing color news and commerce to these bustling hubs. Their unexpected appearances transformed ordinary evenings into moments of cultural exchange and opportunity. Minstrels, musicians, poets, and storytellers traveled from town to town performing for coins, food, or lodging. Their arrival was often eagerly anticipated as they brought fresh songs, ballads of distant lands, and tales of heroic deeds. Their music provided entertainment, but also served as a living archive of history, culture, and folklore. Their performances could be spontaneous or arranged, ranging from soft melodies in a quiet corner to raucous sing-alongs that galvanized the entire tavern. Minstrels were skilled at reading their audience's shifting tone and content to suit the mood. This adaptability helped them earn a living in an often precarious profession. Merchants also played a crucial role in tavern culture. Long-distance traders used taverns as rest stops and informal marketplaces exchanging goods and stories. They introduced exotic products, spices, textiles, metals that fascinated locals, and sparked curiosity about far-off places. These merchants acted as conduits for new ideas and fashions, influencing tastes and social customs. Their presence brought the wider world closer to small towns and villages, bridging the gap between local life and distant lands. The interactions between minstrels, merchants, and locals enriched the tavern's social fabric. They facilitated conversations that ranged from business negotiations to shared stories of adventure. These encounters were often fleeting, but could leave lasting impressions. An intriguing fact is that some minstrels doubled as newsbearers or political agents, using their mobility and networks to spread information or messages discreetly. Similarly, merchants could carry rumors or intelligence along trade routes, turning taverns into nodes in broader communication webs. The mingling of locals with these travelers sometimes created tension as unfamiliar customs or goods challenged traditional ways. Yet it also fostered innovation and cultural dynamism, keeping tavern life fresh and unpredictable. Minstrels and merchants often formed alliances with tavern keepers, benefiting mutually. A popular minstrel could draw crowds and increase sales, while merchants' trade goods might be displayed or sold on site, expanding the tavern's offerings. Their presence underscores the tavern's role as a crossroads of people, stories, goods, and ideas. This intersection shaped medieval society far beyond the walls of the inn, influencing commerce, culture, and community identity. So, envision a medieval tavern alive with music and the bustle of trade where the familiar and foreign intertwined, crafting a lively, ever-changing tapestry of human connection. Hygiene in medieval taverns is a topic surrounded by myths and misconceptions. Popular imagination often conjures scenes of filth, disease, and squalor. But the reality was far more nuanced, though certainly not up to modern standards. Medieval sanitation standards were shaped by a combination of practical necessity, cultural beliefs, and available technology. Tavern keepers, understanding that a foul-smelling establishment would drive away customers, generally made efforts to maintain cleanliness within their means. Sweeping floors, regularly washing tables, and airing out rooms were common practices, though limited by the resources and knowledge of the time. Water for washing was often scarce or contaminated, making full sanitation impossible. Instead, taverns relied on ventilation, opening doors and windows when possible, and the smoke from hearth fires to reduce the presence of pests and odors. Smoke, while irritating to modern lungs, had the side benefit of deterring insects and masking less pleasant smells. Mugs and plates were rinsed between uses, sometimes with vinegar or cold water, but deep cleaning was rare. The wooden and ceramic vessels could harbor bacteria, but the regular turnover of drink and food somewhat mitigated health risks. Contrary to popular belief, not all taverns were squalid. In some towns, regulations mandated minimum cleanliness standards, and violators faced fines or closure. Tavern keepers took pride in maintaining reputations for quality, understanding that a clean environment was good for business. Pest control was a constant concern. Rats, mice, and insects were drawn to spilled grain and food scraps. Cats, as discussed earlier, were invaluable in keeping rodent populations in check. Sometimes, hawks or other birds were used in courtyards to hunt vermin. Personal hygiene among patrons varied widely. Bathing was not as infrequent as sometimes portrayed, especially in towns with public bathhouses. However, crowded taverns could be hotbeds for lice and other parasites, contributing to discomfort and illness. The risk of disease transmission was real but complex. Tavern environments facilitated the spread of respiratory illnesses and infections. Yet they also provided social and psychological benefits that were important to well-being. Interestingly, some taverns incorporated medicinal herbs into their decor or menus, believed to purify air or aid health. Aromatic plants like rosemary, thyme, or lavender might be hung or burned, their scents masking odors and providing comfort. The popular image of medieval taverns as cesspools overlooks these efforts and the variability between establishments. Hygiene standards depended on location, wealth, and individual management, resulting in a spectrum from relatively clean to truly filthy. This nuanced view helps us understand medieval taverns as lived spaces, imperfect but functional, where people navigated health risks for the sake of community and enjoyment. So, as you imagine the smoky, lively tavern, remember it was neither paradise nor plague pit, but a complex environment shaped by the realities and knowledge of its time. The architecture of medieval taverns was a direct reflection of their function, location, and the social dynamics they fostered. These buildings ranged from simple wooden structures to more substantial stone edifices, each design shaping the tavern's atmosphere and operations. Early taverns were often timber-framed, constructed with locally sourced wood and thatched roofs. Their walls, sometimes wattle and daub, offered limited insulation against the elements, making the interiors chilly in winter and sweltering in summer. The low ceilings, blackened by smoke from open hearths, created an intimate but smoky environment. Windows were small, and few designed more to keep out weather and thieves than to provide light or ventilation. Glass panes were rare and expensive. Many taverns used oiled parchment or left windows open with shutters. The dim lighting inside was supplemented by candles, lanterns, or the flicker of the central fire. Larger taverns in towns or on major roads often incorporated stone foundations or walls, reflecting greater wealth or status. Stone provided durability and better fire resistance, important in crowded urban areas. These taverns might feature multiple rooms, including private chambers for rent storage areas and stables for horses. The interior layout usually centered around a large communal hall with long wooden tables and benches. The hearth was the focal point, providing warmth and a place for cooking. The tavern's barkeep operated from a counter or bar area, managing orders and overseeing the crowd. Separate rooms or booths offered some privacy used for meetings, card games, or intimate conversations. In wealthier establishments, these spaces were decorated with tapestries or wooden paneling, adding a touch of comfort and style. The design also accounted for practical needs: storage for barrels of ale, racks for coats and weapons, and spaces for entertainers. The floors were often earthen or covered with rushes, which were periodically replaced to absorb spills and odors. Fire safety was a constant concern. Open flames near wooden beams and thatch created risks, leading some taverns to build chimneys or smoke hoods to direct smoke outside. However, many continued using open hearths, accepting the trade-off between atmosphere and danger. Externally, taverns were often clustered near marketplaces, docks, or road junctions to maximize accessibility. Their signs hung prominently, inviting travelers and locals alike. The building's architecture influenced social behavior. The crowded, noisy halls encouraged mingling and communal activity, while private rooms allowed for exclusivity or discretion. The spatial arrangement reflected the tavern's dual nature as a public and semi-private space. Some taverns evolved over time, expanding or remodeling to meet changing demands or tastes. This adaptability helped them remain central to community life despite economic or social shifts. The physical environment shaped the sensory experience. Dark corners, smoky air, rough surfaces, immersing patrons in a world quite different from modern comfort. This architecture fostered a sense of belonging and shared identity among regulars. Understanding tavern architecture provides insight into the practical and cultural realities of medieval life. These buildings were more than shelters. They were stages on which the complex drama of social life unfolded nightly. So, as you picture a medieval tavern, imagine the creak of timber, the glow of firelight on stone walls, and the crowded hum of voices filling a space designed for connection and celebration. As the night wears on, the tavern approaches its closing time, a ritual filled with its own rhythms, warnings, and farewells. This transition from lively chaos to quiet solitude marks the end of another chapter in the tavern's ongoing story. Closing time was often announced loudly by the tavern keeper or an assistant calling out last orders to prompt patrons to finish their drinks. This announcement served both practical and social functions, signaling the winding down of service and preparing customers for departure. The pace of the tavern shifted. Conversations slowed, music softened, and the energy gradually faded. Patrons began settling debts, gathering belongings, and saying their goodbyes. Some stumbled toward the door, guided by friends or the dim light of street lamps, while others lingered reluctant to leave the warmth and company. In some places, strict curfews or local laws dictated closing times, with authorities patrolling to enforce them. Taverns caught staying open late risked fines or temporary closure. However, enforcement varied, and some establishments stayed open as long as business warranted and the fire burned. Closing rituals often involved the tavern keeper counting coins, cleaning tables, and securing the premises. Staff might sweep floors, extinguish candles, and lock doors. These tasks were essential to prepare for the next day's patrons and maintain order. Farewells were an important part of the social fabric. Promises to meet again, thanks to the host, and sharing of final jokes or stories created a sense of continuity and belonging. For many, the tavern was a second home, and closing time was a reluctant farewell. One curious tradition involved patrons sharing a final communal toast, before departing, an expression of goodwill and shared experience that reinforced social bonds. Sometimes this toast honored absent friends' local saints, or simply the hope for another gathering. As the tavern emptied, the sensory atmosphere changed dramatically. The noise faded into echoes, the smells of ale and stew lingered, and the smoky haze slowly lifted. The empty tables and benches stood silent, waiting for the next night's stories. In rural areas, closing time often coincided with the natural rhythms of the community farmers and laborers rising early to tend fields, merchants preparing for market days. In towns, the end of the night marked a shift toward quieter domestic life or the bustle of night watchmen. The transition from opening to closing encapsulated the tavern's role as a temporal sanctuary, a place apart from daily worries yet firmly embedded in the community's cycles. Interestingly, some taverns developed unique closing customs or superstitions. For example, the last mug might be reserved for a spirit or left on the bar as an offering for good luck. These practices underscored the tavern's place not just in social life, but in local folklore. Closing time could also be a moment of reflection or storytelling, with the last patrons sharing quiet confidences or planning future meetings. This intimacy contrasted with the earlier rowdiness, highlighting the tavern's multifaceted nature. In some, the end of the evening was as significant as its beginning, marking the conclusion of communal rituals and the promise of their return. So, as the lights dim and the doors close on the medieval tavern's lively night, imagine the echoes of laughter and conversation lingering in the air, a testament to human connection across centuries. The medieval tavern, with all its noise, warmth, stories, and chaos, was more than just a place to drink. It was a microcosm of society, a stage where the dramas of daily life played out in all their messy, vibrant glory. Over the past hours, we've journeyed through its smoky rooms, met its colorful patrons, and glimpsed its many roles in the medieval world. As the night closes, it's worth reflecting on what made these taverns such enduring institutions. Taverns provided a rare space where social boundaries blurred. Peasants, merchants, soldiers, and sometimes even nobility found themselves sharing tables and stories, their lives briefly entwined by the communal need for warmth and company. This mingling, although limited by the realities of medieval hierarchy, offered moments of equality and shared humanity. The tavern's role extended beyond socializing. It was an economic engine. Innkeepers managed complex operations balancing hospitality and profit, while traveling merchants and minstrels infused new ideas and goods, connecting far-flung regions through trade and culture. The sensory landscape, the clatter of mugs, smoky air-mingled smells of food and sweat, was integral to the experience, forging memories that lingered long after patrons left. Cats prowled underfoot, keeping pests at bay, while music and games animated the evenings with laughter and competition. Regulations and societal tensions played out within these walls, reflecting wider struggles between order and freedom. Taverns were both sites of celebration and suspicion places, where authorities kept wary eyes even as communities found respite and joy. Women's roles in taverns, complex and multifaceted, mirrored broader gender dynamics, revealing spaces of both empowerment and constraint. Crime and disorder coexisted with hospitality and tradition, weaving a rich social tapestry. Architecturally, taverns ranged from humble timber halls to sturdy stone buildings, their design shaping and reflecting the social interactions within. The closing rituals marked not just an end, but a promise of return renewal and the ongoing story of communal life. Strange facts, scholarly debates, and little-known customs all remind us that medieval taverns were far from simple. They were living institutions full of contradictions and charm, capturing the essence of a world both alien and familiar. So, next time you find yourself in a modern pub surrounded by laughter and clinking glasses, remember the medieval tavern, a place where centuries ago people just like you sought connection, solace, and a good tale. Their spirit endures in every shared story, every raised mug and every smoky room filled with life. Medieval taverns were far more than mere places to drink. They were vibrant social hubs that pulsed with life and complexity, serving as crossroads where peasants, merchants, knights, and travelers mingled. Taverns blurred social boundaries and fostered a rare sense of community in a hierarchical world. The mix of hearty food ale and lively entertainment created a sensory-rich environment defined by smoky air, raucous laughter, clinking mugs, and the subtle prowling of tavern cats who played a vital role in pest control. Tavern keepers were the unsung orchestrators balancing hospitality business and order amid unpredictable crowds. Their savvy management ensured taverns remained hubs of commerce and culture while navigating laws that regulated hours behavior and prices laws that were often hotly debated and unevenly enforced. These establishments were spaces of both joy and tension, reflecting wider societal struggles between control and freedom. Women's presence in taverns was complex, encompassing roles as servers, entertainers, owners, and sometimes stigmatized patrons, mirroring the gender dynamics of the time. Taverns also attracted crime and conflict, with pickpockets, brawls, and intrigue weaving into their fabric. Yet these dangers were part of what made taverns places of raw, unfiltered human experience. Traveling minstrels and merchants brought stories, songs, goods, and news from distant lands, enriching the tavern's cultural life and connecting local communities to the broader medieval world. The architecture of taverns, from timber halls to stone buildings, was shaped by their social function. Closing rituals marked the end of nightly gatherings, reinforcing social bonds and promising future meetings. In all medieval taverns were living institutions where history, culture, and everyday life converged, a testament to humanity's enduring desire for connection, storytelling, and shared experience. End of script. Sleep well.